How are objects in Revit actually created? How do you make the shapes that are visible in the model? Well, there are a couple of different ways, but these are all using basic massing tools. So you create objects using these specialized tools. And Revit offers three basic ways that you can create these sort of massed elements. One is one that we're familiar with. It's a component, and you can model it in place. And that allows you to model something within the geometry of your project. And this is great when, for example, you want something that goes around a column or some other built-in element. You can respect that. You can make copies of this component in the project and adapt each copy for a unique situation. So it's kind of a lot like a group in SketchUp, where the group can be unique from the other objects. Now, if you want a component that is more typical, like a piece of furniture where they are created independently, you can create a component on its own. This is an independent file, and it's easy to share, and it shows up nicely in things like fixture and furniture schedules. And this is one that you can have other people working on while you're working on your model. The last thing that you can do is create masses. So this is your third option. Masses are really nice when you want to create an object that is much more organic. Perhaps it doesn't have parameters the components might have, but you have a lot more freedom to model. And you can do an in-place mass, which respects the geometry of the model, and you can draw an object off a wall or a floor or a ceiling just by making reference to those work planes. Or you can create a freestanding conceptual model. And with those, you can actually use the conceptual model to mass an entire building. Let's start by creating a component in place. I think I'm going to put a little bench around this column that is in my project. And this is a good way to show the basic elements of modeling in place. So you choose Component, Model in Place, and you have to choose what type of family this component is going to be. These are essentially the layers in Revit, but it's also how Revit organizes visibility of different objects. So in this case, I think I'll choose Furniture and OK. And it doesn't honestly change anything about the model itself, but it does change how Revit organizes it. If I, for example, hide all the furniture, this object will go with it. So once I choose this option, I'm in a sketch mode. As you can see, the model goes kind of gray. And there are a number of different things here. Actually, if you go on the right side, that's where I'm going to start. There's this option to set the work plane. And this tells Revit where you're drawing. And I'll just click on that, and it brings up a menu. And you can pick any object that is labeled in your model. Now, in this case, the main thing that's labeled are the levels. So I'll choose the ground floor. And you can see how it highlights it down here. I could also pick a plane, and then it will allow me to click on a different plane, and I could draw off of, say, a wall or even the face of a column. But those do have to be flat planes, and this is going to be easier. So I'll click OK. So now I'm drawing on the floor, and you can see here on the main Create menu, there are a number of different tools that are kind of standard throughout the component world in Revit. There's an extrusion. There's a blend, which creates a shape, but it creates a shape that is combined of two kind of profiles. There's a revolve, which allows you to create a shape that is rotated around an axis. There's a sweep, which is taking a profile and kind of dragging it along a path. And then a swept blend, where it's kind of like a blend. You can have two different profiles at either end and create an interesting form. Now, each of these are solid forms. You can do the exact same ones in void forms. And sometimes it's easier to draw a solid and make a void around it. Other times it's easier to just draw the model itself. So for example, I'm going to draw the seat for the bench. I'll go into this top view, and I'll draw an extrusion. And when you click on the extrusion menu, now you're in kind of a sub-sketch mode. You have all the usual line drawing tools. I think I'm just going to draw a circle here to represent the bench. It's a purple reference line. These lines can be nudged. They do usually have a grip, depending on how they were drawn, that allows you to change the size. And of course, you can also type in a dimension here. So it's very, very handy, a lot of different options. You can also use the offset tool. So your typical bench is perhaps, oh, I don't know, maybe about 2 feet deep, given how deep the seat might be. I can offset this object. I can also draw with any of these objects just so long as they form a complete loop, and any interior surface also forms a complete loop. The other thing about creating these extrusions is they have a dimension, how high or how horizontal they're going to go. So I could even just set this to 18 inches, which is probably about the typical height for, whoops, 18 correctly, 18 inches, probably a typical height for a bench. Click apply. And now that I've drawn the circles, and here I'll rotate around so you can see what happens when I click the checkbox in edit mode. Once I click that checkbox, I am in edit mode, or I exit the object edit mode, that extrusion edit mode, but I am still inside the family. Okay, I'm still inside the component. And what you'll see here is that the object has these little grips that are visible, so you can still actually make changes. I could move the object left or right. I could drag the top or the bottom up or down, and it's still in 3D view, so I could make this, say, I don't know, let's make it kind of thin so that it's kind of a seat thickness. So pretty easy. Now, I'm not going to click Finish Model yet because I want to draw some other things. I think I'm going to draw some legs on this guy, and maybe I'll draw a back for it. So back in the Create menu, there's a couple different ways that you can create these objects. So for example, I could create a blend, and to do that, you just click the Blend tool. Now I'm in the Sub-Object Editing mode. And once again, I can select reference planes, and here now we'll try picking a plane, and OK. And you don't have to design it this way. I'm just going to design it this way because I want to make sure that you know how to draw all the different objects in Revit. I'm going to click on the underside of this table here, this bench, and draw my top circle. You can see here where it says Edit Top. That shows you the position that I'm editing right now. If I click on it, it switches to editing the base. Well, now I can set my reference plane to the ground. And before, see how it says extrusion? That was a temporary reference plane. I'll just choose the ground floor and close that out. And maybe I'll draw a rectangle down on the floor. And of course, it is awfully helpful to be able to see the two in reference to each other. So maybe I'll draw a little itty-bitty rectangle on the ground. And now, if I were to take a look at it, the two surfaces should be on separate reference planes, although actually it does kind of look like they're on the same plane. Maybe I messed that up somehow, but let's finish editing this sweep here, or this blend, and you can see, oh yeah, somehow I've gotten it up a little higher. But because it is editable after the fact, I can go here and I can make this object go down to the ground. And again, like we've seen with other objects, you can reference another layer or another level, and you can even lock it to that level if you're so inclined. Now, the other thing you can do here, this is the work plane that this object was created on. And I believe it was referencing this top of the bench. I can dissociate that by clicking on it, and now I can actually kind of move this thing in any which direction that I so desire. I don't really need to do that, but just note that reference planes, when you create an object, they are still kind of glued to those reference planes. Now let's try another object type. Go to Create, and let's make a revolve. And these are awfully fun to do. I'll click Revolve. I'm going to set my work plane to a vertical work plane. So I'm going to just pick a plane, and I could type in PK. That's what the parentheses there mean. And let's click this vertical work plane so that I'm drawing in a. Now, sometimes you want to create an object kind of out in space here, and there isn't a handy-dandy reference plane. So I want to create a table leg that is a revolve. And what I need to do first, I'm just going to click Finish Model, and I'm going to draw a reference plane here in front of the table, or maybe kind of underneath it. These reference planes, they're kind of like lines. You can nudge them. You can also name them. So I'm going to call it leg for now. And then I'm going to double-click on my bench to continue editing it. Now I have my object creation tools available again. So I'll click Revolve. And what you can see is you basically are drawing a sketch. In this case, I want it to be a vertical sketch, and a sketch of the profile, and then a sketch of the boundary line. So the boundary line, I should set my work plane so that it is that reference plane I just created. See how it shows up in my list right now? And OK, and it might give you a message saying, hey, I can't draw on that reference plane in this view. I need to be in the 3D view in order to draw. And now, of course, we are looking at the front of my bench, and I can draw in that reference plane. And it is a little tricky because you have to trust that the lines that you're drawing are going to show up in the correct place. But now I can easily draw the boundary line. You see how it's highlighted. And I'm just going to draw a very shape here. And of course, I could be much more picky about how this looks, but I could draw arcs, I could draw curve, all sorts of curves. The main thing is that the boundary line has to be a continuous loop. Okay, and if we look at this in 3D space here, you'll see there's my boundary out floating in space. Okay, let's go back to the front view here, and I do like to draw in this 3D base view, the one that you get by clicking on the little house, the default 3D view. Not everybody likes doing that, but I find it's awfully simple. Anyway, the axis line is the line around which this object is going to rotate. If the line does not touch the object, if it's, say, out here, I'm going to end up with a kind of cylinder. However, I think I'm going to draw it along this edge here so that I end up with a solid object. And I'll click the checkbox, and now you can see I've got myself a nice little table leg. Now, like we saw before, there is this lock to the reference plane button. It's locked to that leg reference plane I created. I can just dissociate it. And now I can actually make lots and lots of copies of this object. Here, let's go to the top view so that we can see what we're looking at here. Top view. And here's my object. Now, of course, you can't quite see it. It does help to come here to the visibility graphic visibility options and choose wireframe. And now you can see all the objects here. And it's just another object. Again, I'm still inside the component, but I can say Control click and copy this. I could also use the copy command if I so desired. So there's all sorts of ways that you can create a bunch of legs. And maybe I'll get rid of this leg. I didn't like it that much. So that is the revolve. And it's, again, a really simple way that you can create objects in your project. For the back of the bench, I think I'm going to use what's called a sweep. And these are fun because you can draw a path for the object to the profile to follow along. In this case, I'm going to click Sketch Path. And you do want to make sure that your work plane is something reasonable. So in this case, I'm going to pick a plane, and I'm going to actually draw on the top of my bench here. And I'll go into top view. It just make sure that you're not drawing on the ground or somewhere that doesn't make sense for the object you're creating. And we can use any of these tools. Perhaps I'll use this inscribed polygon here. And to do that, you just click on a center point and then draw the shape itself. And just keep moving it in or out until you get the size and shape that you want. And that's your path. You have to edit the exit the path edit mode, so click the checkbox. And remember, we are in a kind of nested sketching here. Now, for the profile, you might say, well, can I pick one of the ones? And of course, you can. You can choose one of the profiles that we've already loaded in here. There's quite a lot, gutters and parapets and things like that. However, we can also draw them. And if you look here, there's this little itty-bitty reference plane that is kind of perpendicular to the path that I just drew. That is where I can draw whatever kind of profile I want for my bench. You just choose Edit Profile, and now once again you are in a kind of sub sketch mode. And then I can use any of my drawing tools. And let's just keep this simple for now. We'll give it a little kind of bevel that goes up a certain amount. Go. And of course, you can add in little hooks and curves to make your design fun and interesting, but we don't want any fun and interesting. So now I'll exit the profile sketch mode. Now I'm back in the sweep edit mode. Here's my path, here's my profile, and then you just click the finish edit mode, and there you go. You've got yourself a nice back for your model. To finish off our lovely bench, let's create a handrail. Now to do this, we have one more object type, and I've actually accidentally clicked out of this component, so I'll just double click on my component in place. Go to the Create tab, and there is one other thing we haven't drawn yet. It's a swept blend. And what this is, it's just like a blend, except you have a path with two profiles, and it somehow magically morphs them together. So I'm going to click that swept blend. I do want to, as I have before, choose a work plane. And in this case, I'm going to draw the path to go from a high point down to a low point. So I really should pick a vertical plane. And I'll just click on the face of this column, see how it highlights it as I move over. So let's put ourselves in this front view here so we can kind of see what we're doing pretty well. And then we're going to choose the swept blend tool and click on the sketch path. And this will allow us to sketch the path any which way we want. And in this case, I'm going to use a tool we haven't used yet for drawing lines, which is the spline tool. And what's fun about the spline tool is it creates these kind of working points that you can modify after the fact. You just kind of click a bunch of times. You can also just move your mouse until it's horizontal with the ground. And if you hit escape, that will end your path. And let me orbit this a little bit, and you'll see that this is going to be a blend that follows along this path and has two profiles. And you can continue to edit the profile here, the path that you've created, just by using these kind of grips that show up. You can make it kind of more fun, or however you like. When you're done editing the path, you click Finish Edit Mode. Okay, then choose Profile number 1, and it gets a little highlighted here, or de-lighted, I guess. And you can edit that profile. And like before, we can draw in whatever shape we want. Let's just keep this fairly simple here. I'm going to draw maybe a rectangular shape for the upper profile. Click Check to edit the sub edit mode. And then Sketch Profile 2, you can choose Edit Profile. Again, it highlights it to show you where you're drawing. Make sure you can see what you're drawing. You know, you may have to rotate the model. I think I'll just go with a simple circle down here. And sometimes you will draw something that the computer just can't figure out how to do, and it will give you an error message. But usually you can just click Check, and like magic, it creates this unique shape. Finally, we have this Dissociate Workplane button, which I would take advantage of just because I know it's not exactly where I want it to be. Once you do that, it is no longer glued to kind of the face of the column, and I can come in here. Maybe I'll do this from the top view. See how it's kind of associated with that reference plane. But once you dissociate it, you can move it around. You can kind of blend these things together, and of course you can use the copy tool and copy it all you want. You can copy one over there, and you can rotate it and create kind of a fun shape. Now, because of all the reference planes, a lot of these objects will act strangely. Like this one, I can't rotate it, because it's still kind of the object that was extruded, these reference planes are unfortunately undissociatable when it comes to rotating it. However, a little trick is you can pick a new work plane for this object. Just select it, and now when I move it over this face of the column, see how I'm selecting this face, it should move my object into the correct position. Again, you can try to dissociate it. Sometimes it'll get you in the right world, and sometimes it won't. But usually you can kind of get copies if you can find the correct plane to dissociate it, and then the correct plane to reassociate it. And I think this kind of works, more or less. And you can see here I've got a couple more copies that I've associated with these side reference planes. And again, I have to kind of move them in position. And remember, like with all designed objects, you have to consider both their kind of elevation view and their plan view. Let's make sure that we're got this in the right position, and lo and behold, we don't. And again, I use a combination of the move tool, and just nudging it frequently is all you need to do. So after all that, you just click Finish Model, and you've got yourself a component created in place. You will also notice that there are these grips visible on all of these, and these allow you to modify objects kind of after the fact. For instance, this one I must have dragged down. I can drag it back up again. The trick is always kind of seeing what it is that you're modifying. And if things are not looking right now, I'm never going to see this underneath here. But if I were, you could use the Align tool to get yourself a nice looking object. And you can also make a copy of this object. I'll just control click, and there's my copy. But like the other objects, these are kind of locked to the reference plane around which they were created. So really, these are great for one-off types of objects. We can also create a component as a standalone family, and sometimes this is very handy. You just go to the File, New, Family, and this allows you to collaborate with other people, share objects a little more easily. It's not an object which is based just in your project. Now, we use the English imperial system, even though even the English don't use the imperial system. They use metric, but go figure. And you'll see here they're all the same categories that we saw before. Just to show you how this works, there are obviously furniture ones that we used before. You can also make models that are based on reference planes that are not flat. And this allows you to force an object to always occur in one position. So I'm going to choose, say, a wall-based component here. And what happens when you create a family is it usually opens a bunch of views. So this is the floor plan view. Here's the left view, and you see how it has the placement side indicated. It also has the elevation view, and then view 1, which I think is a 3D view. So you can draw in any of these views, and let's say I want to just create something which comes off the wall and maybe is I don't know, what, a kind of vase or something that sticks outside of the wall. I can very easily create that by using any of the tools that we discussed earlier. So I'm not going to go over all of these tools. However, I just want to make sure you realize you have to draw these things based on some reference plane as you go along. So here, let's speed it up a little bit so you can see me creating a few masses. Once you're done with all of your massing, and I'm making a weird, I don't know, maybe sculptural light fixture thing, you just load it into your project, and you can close it. It will prompt you to save it. I'm going to save this guy onto my computer first, and then I will load it into my project and close it. So. And what you'll find when you load it into your project is that it wants to go on a wall. That's how you created it. And if you don't like the way it looks in your project, Nice thing is it can move around quite easily. So unlike the reference plane locked objects that we created before, I can move this up and down, left and right. And that's the flexibility that you get when you've created a component. Now, the problem is if you don't like something, you have to kind of double click on it, open up the family again, and then go through the whole process. And anything that you want to modify, you have to kind of click through and start editing all sorts of different things here. Whatever it is that you want to change. And those changes will not be reflected until you finally drag it back into your project here. Let's pull this up a little bit, make it a little smaller, and yes, click through the menus, load it into the project. And of course, it does want me to ask if I want to save it, which I do. I want to replace it. Now, the other thing is when you bring a modified family back into your project, it will give you this perplexing menu. Should you just overwrite it? Or should you overwrite it and its parameter values? Now, typically I choose the second one because sometimes you have made changes that you want to be reflected dimensionally. Occasionally when you have a lot of parameters that are only for individual instances, you don't want to overwrite them, but most of the time the second option is the way to go. And there you go, you can see that my object has changed. And while we're talking about families, let's talk about making a new profile family. Remember, profiles are the things which defined handrails, but also our lintels and windowsills. We can create our own. Just go to the File, New, Family, like we did before, and you want to scroll down and look for profiles, but there are a couple of different kinds. Obviously, you'll want to choose if you're making a rail or a reveal or a mullion, you want to choose those. But for us, we're just going to choose Profile Hosted. And I'll open that up. And it opens up a view which essentially is the cross-section. And all you have to do is use lines to draw the profile that you want. And here I've drawn a water table, which is the base that is on the exterior of masonry walls sometimes. Just drawn a little profile from kind of my imagination. And you do have to remember to draw it on the far side of where all these little notes are. This is the wall, basically. That's what host means. And don't forget to save it. You want to save it into your project. And then load into your project and close like we did before. And there we go. I created a new profile here in the project, new sweep family. I applied this profile, and like magic, I've got my wall. And these can be, when they're inserted, I think this may actually be, is it upside down? No, it's not upside down. It's right side up. These can be flipped upside down. Occasionally that happens. You just use the flipper tool to place it. So far, we have used the standard types of masses that come with Revit that are typical of components. But if you really want to get something organic and kind of more free flow, there are what are called masses, in-place masses, which are actually different and than these other types of masses because they're a lot more flexible. First of all, when I click the In-Place Mass tool, it will give you this warning message which says, hey, I'm temporarily showing you masses in your project. And I'm going to just tell it to stop telling me that. But what it means here, and I'll just call it, I don't know, sculpture or something like that. What it's telling me is that normally it doesn't display masses. And so you'll have to, if you have other views where these show up, I'm just going to cancel this for a second. You do need to turn on masses in any view where this occurs. The way you do that, you go to this Visibility and Graphic Overrides here in your View Properties menu. And this is kind of like the Layers menu in AutoCAD. It has all the stuff that can show up in your project organized automatically by family type. And you see here how masses are turned off. You can just turn those on, hit apply, and OK, and you'll get the same effect. OK, back to our mass in place. So I go to the Massing and Site ribbon, Mass in Place, and I'll call it Sculpture again. And basically you have some similar drawing tools. So for example, I could draw a box, but look at the way my cursor behaves. See how it jumps to to anything my object, my mouse is over, and it will draw on that reference plane. So you no longer have to kind of be careful about defining your reference plane, and a little more like SketchUp. The other thing is you can create these objects, and once they're created, you can kind of manipulate them, make them a little warpy. But then there's no sweeping or blending or any of that. You just choose Create Form. And by the way, you can create a solid or a void form. Let's start with solid forms. And you get what's called a gizmo on top of the kind of surface that initially is just an extrusion. However, what's cool, you can just click on the directional arrows, and actually conveniently they are the same colors as SketchUp's axes. But the other funny thing that you can do here that you can't do anywhere else is you can manipulate some of these elements. So for example, I was moving this whole top plane. Revit, as you mouse over different elements, see how it highlights either the whole surface, this line, or I can even grab a point. And each one, when you click on it, you'll get a different gizmo. Okay. Here, I'll move over this surface. If you're not getting what you want, hit Tab, and you see how it will cycle through the different elements. So here I can stretch that whole thing, whole face, but I can also just grab one line and I can manipulate that. And you can get some pretty funky looking shapes almost immediately because what Revit will do is it will warp the surfaces. I'm going to make this shaded so you can kind of get a better sense of what these look like. You see how it's actually not a flat surface in the front anymore. So again, these are not the most practical sorts of thing, but they're great sometimes when you want to create perhaps a site element, maybe some rocks, maybe something sculptural, or you want a highly organic, I don't know, light fixture or ceiling element. This is really the only way. And you can manipulate these guys further by adding in void forms. So let's say I want to just cut a hole through this object. I guess there's nothing flat left on it. I can draw myself a form and a circle and extrude it, but this time let's create a void form. And what it will do, it wants to know, do you want a circular form or tube-shaped form? And I can just drag this guy right up. And like before, I have handles that I can manipulate this object. It does get a little confusing because we are in three-dimensional space. So, you know, it's a lot like SketchUp in that you can easily get kind of lost in where you are. But once you have created your void form, then usually if you hit Finish Mass, it will cut it automatically. If it does not cut it automatically, and see this one, I purposely made it so it would not, you can use this Cut Geometry tool. And what this does, you can see here, you click on the solid form, the form that you want to be cut first, and then you click on the Cutter, and like magic, it kind of creates a little piece of Swiss cheese. Now, sometimes this gets you into trouble, and I'll just click Finish Mass here, and you can kind of see what the object looks like. And masses, by default, they kind of show as this sort of weird, ephemeral material. You can double-click on them to edit them. The trick is getting that void again. If I want to have the void selected, it's super difficult. You kind of have to hit Tab a bunch of times, and hopefully you can get the void form. Oh, there we go. We got it. For whatever reason, they make it very hard to select them after the fact. So try to get those voids created as well as possible initially. So if the mass in place option doesn't give you enough flexibility, there are some shapes that actually can only be created as a conceptual mass. And if you go to File, New, there's an option here to choose Conceptual Mass, and it's a template within Revit. And here they are, and it basically is a different kind of family. I'm going to choose Mass here, open it up. And what you'll see is basically a 3D drawing space with a couple of reference planes. Now, the best use of this conceptual massing tool is actually for creating things like a building model. It works in a very similar way to what we saw before. You can draw shapes in plan. And note the scale. These are, that says 24. What is that? 20 feet. So these are big objects. Okay, they're meant to be buildings. The trick here is I can create additional reference planes by just copying these reference planes that are here. I could have, say, a blend that works on 3 different reference planes. So I'll just double click on this reference plane to work on it, and I'll draw a circle here. And then I'll go up to the top reference plane, again using the modify command, just double click on it. And let's draw a kind of oval shape. How about that? And you can actually, you know, kind of see where these things are in relation to each other just by kind of going to a top view. We are in that standard 3D view. But what this allows us to do, we have 3 different profiles in 3 different places in space. I can select these objects and I can create a form. And like before, I can create a solid or a void form. But having these reference planes is just so handy. And then I can continue to modify these like I did before, just, you know, using the gizmos that pop up. And sometimes you can't modify something. Let's see if I can make it crash here. You know, sometimes you can't make it quite crash when you want it to, and it always happens to be that way. But you can still manipulate things and create some really interesting kind of twisty forms. The other thing is that you can set the reference plane to be really any flat plane. So I could choose this top plane here, and I could draw some more shapes onto that. And again, just start creating different extrusions, which is kind of the basic form. But I could also create a void form. And like we saw before, it's asking me, do I want this to be a round or a tube shape? If I chose the round shape, and this time to get kind of like a little weird divot there. Now I went back to a simpler form here just to show you one of the other things you can do with these conceptual masses. And that is you can add in different elements to them, including vertical profiles and edges. So you have to select the mass or some piece of it. And this allows you, like the image shows, to add in kind of an extra vertical slice. And now I can, say, warp it and create a different face. And sometimes you'll get these weird error messages, especially as you start rotating and twisting things. The other thing you can do, again, I'll select the mass, is I can add profiles. And what this does, I'll add a couple here at different levels here, and add another profile here, and add another profile here. And you might think, well, you know, what good does that do me? Well, in theory, if you can select one of them, you can actually modify these profiles independently. And it's a little tricky because they're hard to see. But now I can really start to create some interesting shapes just by modifying those profiles. You can also, once again, by selecting the whole mass, you can basically dissolve the whole thing. And then you can have access to these profiles. They have kind of a center point, but if you do that, now you can start to manipulate the building in some really interesting ways just by dragging them. They will drag in a planar form, so you see how they're all like that. And then to recreate the building, you have to kind of select them all. I do find occasionally I'll do this, not occasionally, somewhat frequently, you'll do this and then you'll try to create the form, and it doesn't work because it says, oh, you know, I can't create that geometry. And this is true when you have something like overlapping geometry. Now, while we're talking about funny things you can do, another thing you can do is select a surface or all the surface, and you can divide it up into kind of a subsurfaces. And I'm going to actually click the little down arrow here to give you the menu so you can kind of see what's going on. But you can divide this surface up into a grid, and then there's all sorts of patterns, including geometric patterns that you can apply to it. The vertical grid is the V grid, and the U grid is the horizontal grid. So like this is a really tall building, so we might want to make this like some larger number, this some smaller number. Click OK. And then you just click the divide surface button, and it will divide it up into this grid. And you'll see those numbers here in the properties menu. You can still continue to change that if you want something that looks a little different. But the other thing is that this can have a pattern applied to it, which is kind of a cool thing to do. You can make it, say, a hexagonal or octagonal pattern, and you can get some pretty interesting effects on there. The other interesting thing is that is independent of the mass. I think you can still get the mass back from underneath there. You see how there's like a kind of Z fighting going on here, a little crackling. That's the mass underneath it. And it is even possible to create custom patterns with three-dimensional geometry associated with them. And that you can actually do some pretty cool things to create some giant sculptural buildings. But more common is actually to use this mass as an element that you can generate building models from. I'll show you here. What you do is I'm going to actually go backwards and go prior to the divide surface command. You can just click the down arrow, and actually you can go backwards in time as far as you like. So now I have undivided this surface, and I'm going to save it and load it into my project. And I actually created just an empty project that I can use to put this model in. Oh, and by the way, I am trying to place it on a face. You don't want to do that. You want to just place it on the work plane. The model should go in. And once you've placed the conceptual mass in here, you can actually use it to generate all sorts of typical building components. For example, if we want to create exterior walls, we just choose, instead of the normal wall tools, we choose wall by face. And you can see here from the little movie that it's going to create a face based on whatever we click on. And you can choose any of your usual wall types here. We'll make this brick, so we can see the brick face here. And of course, it's clicks on whatever face that you've got. Here, let's shade this, and you should see some brick. I am seeing the mass here behind this, so you're getting some interesting effects. And let's hide the conceptual mass here so we can see the walls in a little cleaner fashion. Actually, one trick is you can use a crossing window, which is the same in SketchUp or AutoCAD, this crossing versus a selection window. But now filter my selection to just have my mass selected. And now I can just right-click on it and choose Hide Elements. And now you see here it's a much more bricky-looking building. Another fun thing you can do, actually, I'm going to go backwards here to get rid of all those walls, and go back a little bit farther here, and show you another fun feature, which is you can create floors from the same mass. If I go to a front view here, and I'll create a few levels here. Let's make this, I don't know, 15 feet up. It's still kind of close, but we'll make another copy, a couple copies here, 15 feet or so. We don't need to do a million of them, but imagine you have a building where you have a bunch of levels. You can select the mass and tell it, hey, create floors that are based on the levels you have in your model. So I've just created this cool conceptual mass, but I'm going to turn it into a series of irregular floor plates. Just click this button, and it says, which levels do you want to have floors on? Click OK. And now I have basically a funny outline. And then I can go, and that outline is just a kind of temporary holding place here. It's what they call a mass floor. But now when I go to my floor tool, once again, I have the floor by face option. And it's just going to say which of these mass floors do you want to turn into floor slabs. Select the ones you want, select the type of floor you want, and then click Create Floor. And like magic, it will create these floors that are typical architectural elements, and they will show up in floor plan, and they'll host furniture. So this could easily end up being a giant skyscraper. And anytime you're creating a new building in Revit, This is actually probably the fastest way. Rather than drawing individual lines for or individual walls and trying to create a roof and all that kind of stuff, I can actually just kind of create a conceptual mass or a mass in place if it's a simple building. And I can pretty much create almost all of the building elements, even the roof, for example. I can create the roof by using this surface and check the Create Roof button. There's my roof, and it becomes an editable architectural element. I can come on and stretch it and do whatever fun roof things you like to do. So that's really the vastly quicker way than drawing individual elements. Mundane and less dramatic geometry level, we can create a little bit of site entourage here, some adjacent buildings, using these same massing tools. And you don't even need to create basements and all that kind of thing. You can leave them as boxes. Also, this technique, using the mass in place, like we've seen before, you can create an entire building. For example, this building here, if I wanted to make this perhaps a more traditional building, I could add in a roof and even dormers. And each of those is just done by setting the work plane. So I can draw on the front of the building and then force it as I draw to stay in that work plane and draw the outline of the roof and the outline of, say, a dormer. Let me show you how that works. You can always come in and make these elements, these faces, into different types of building elements on this massing and site tab. Actually, all of these simple things, creating floors, walls, and roofs by face, all those tools are kind of duplicated here from where they were in the original architecture tab. So it is kind of handy for creating a building that way. Now, another fun thing that you can play with when you're working with masses are curtain systems. And I'll show you what I mean. First of all, I'm going to just draw, or I already did draw, a spline on the ground. And you can create a form out of that spline. And what's cool about that, it has kind of a spline at the top and a spline at the bottom. And you can actually continue to warp the spline here just by clicking and dragging on the control points at either the top or the bottom. And at a smaller scale, this actually makes for a very nice like curtain or thing like that. In fact, you can even gather the curtain, which is kind of a fun thing to do, just by adding in say a profile in the middle, and then when you select the surface again, like we saw before, you can dissolve it. And maybe I'll just make this center piece here a little bit smaller. I'll use the scale tool to shrink down the middle. There we go, a little smaller. And what you should see when you reform the surface is that it ends up being kind of a gathered surface. Fun thing to do. At a larger scale, you can make this into a funky warped facade. And the way you do that, you finish the mass, so it's created, and it is saying this contains only mesh geometry. And you might say, what are you talking about? And what you are talking about, or what Revit is talking about, is that there's no depth to this object. It is a single surface. And this can cause problems in certain situations, particularly rendering. But for what we're doing here, it actually doesn't, because we're going to talk about curtain systems. And what this does is it creates a curtain wall out of whatever face. And this curtain wall in particular, and true of any curtain walls, if they are curved, the system has a funny way of adjusting. And I'll show you what I mean. I'll click on this surface and to select it. And just like we did with mass floors, you can select more than one. Click Create System. And now you have a system with funny panels on it, okay? And we can select the system here, or we can try to get it by hitting Tab to get the entire system. There we go. And what you'll see, there's a default 5-foot by 10-foot system. And if you look at it here, maybe shaded will make it a little clearer. Oh, yeah, a little clearer. It's basically taken the curve and it's flattened each facet based on the rules of the curtain system. Now we can duplicate that curtain system, and we'll just make it, I don't know, 1 foot by 1 foot, just to give it some small. It's probably not real reasonable for a curtain wall system, but it does illustrate the point. If we make this 1 foot by 1 foot and OK, and usually you're supposed to hit apply, but I almost always forget. I think it will work. But after a moment of recalculation, it should redraw this as a 1 by 1 grid. How cool is that? Finally, with these curtain walls, you can go and add mullions to them. Just go to the architecture ribbon, click on mullion, and when you do, what you'll see is that you can add mullions to all grid lines, or you can add them to individual grid lines. This default size here is pretty big, but here, let's just add it to all grid lines. And, well, let's add it to 1 or 2 and see what happens. There we go. And it does get a little confusing, and of course this is a massive project here, massive wall, so if I did it to all grid lines, it actually might take a little while. Word of advice, if you are working with warped surfaces like this, by all means save your project. Save it before you start, because it can take a little bit of time. The last type of mass that we're going to learn how to create is a site topo surface. And you might say, well, why don't I just use an in-place mass and warp it, like you said before? And you absolutely could do that, but a topo surface allows you to build a surface based on points. And this is more typical because we often receive point clouds from our consultants, landscape architects, or civil engineers, and we can just import those in, and it will generate the whole site with the contours and everything using those points. I'm going to exit out of the topo surface for a second, and I want to draw in a couple of reference planes. It's just so helpful. Otherwise, you're just kind of clicking on points in space that, I don't know, it doesn't look nice and neat the way we like it. And I can copy these reference planes pretty easily, and you can, of course, also draw in site boundaries. If that helps. Frequently, the edges of sites are not so nice and neat and rectilinear, but I'd like them to be. So I'm gonna make this, and I'll even draw one here for the sidewalk here. Let's make it about 8 feet off of the front of the building, and those will act as guides. Also, I might not have mentioned it, but you definitely want to draw in the site plan view. And this just allows you to set the project parameters properly. For instance, in the site plan here, it has this little gizmo at the middle here, which shows the base point, the north, east, south, west. And if you're drawing a project where it's not oriented perfectly to the true north, you can modify the angle here. It doesn't rotate your project. Better to do it this way, and then when you place a north arrow, make sure it faces the right way. So anyway, okay, let's start drawing our topo surface. And when you draw it, click the topo surface, you're going to be in point placement mode, and you can specify the height. The default height is actually 0, so let's just start with that. And we'll draw a big rectangle here, and you see how as I draw it, it completes the surface. And I can move these points up and down. So if I select them and I change their elevation, let's make it -2 feet, or something like that, you'll see the site go down. The other thing is that you can add interstitial points, which kind of forces it to fold. So for example, if I want the back of the site to come up by a foot, then I just type in -1. And I'm going to add these points along the edge of the building. Just I find that when you're first drawing it, it's kind of easiest. And there is the nearest snap that allows you to kind of make something is angled properly, or the site is angled properly. And what you'll see here is that as we do this, the site should be warping. It can be a little hard to see here in the 3D view just because it's not a particularly slopey site, but you can see it's kind of going down just a tad. And then I can continue to add sites, and I try to add them kind of across from each other. So -1 foot may be the height of the road. You might have to add in a few points here and there to make it level. Now the road is kind of sloping, so I can change these to -1 foot, and everything is editable after the fact. And if I wanted, say, a curb, I could add in additional points. So this was set to -1 foot. If I add in additional points, choose modify, or choose place point, and make these only -6 inches. Again, do not forget to put in that 6 inches. And I put it just inside this point, then I will go very quickly from -6 to -12, and you can see the site kind of folding here. Now you might say, well, wouldn't this be nice if we could see contours? Geez, I don't see any contours, and it's very hard to read. And this is absolutely true. You can add contours. All you have to do is finish your site, and then you can add this label contours. Now the only trick is they're based on the spacing in the project, so we have to look at the site settings. This is hidden under a little arrow here, kind of a funny spot for Revit anyway. And here you can specify the intervals and where and the contours start and end. So I'm going to go and I'll have them start at I'll actually do -3 feet just in case. I don't know. But anyway, right now they're set to 10-foot increments, which is great for like a really big slopey site. This is a teeny tiny, not very slopey site, so we can make these, say, 3 inches. Okay. And apply and OK. And all of a sudden you start to see contours show up. And you can even label those contours just by clicking the Label Contours button, cleverly labeled, cleverly named. And as you drag across the contours that you want to have a label, you can see here it adds the labels quite nicely. And these labels will update. So for example, if I take the site and topo surface and I choose Edit, and let's say I want to make sure that it's 6 inches down at the landing here, I can place a few more points at -6, and I'm not using a reference line here, but see how the site contours warp as I go forward. Now you can get a sense that the landing shows up in the right spot, and this can be kind of fun. You can nudge these up and down and create an interesting site. For us, you know, we're not modifying the site a whole heck of a lot, but we can at least demonstrate the contours, and you see how they relabel as you go. So that is how you create the topo surface. And I'll just finish it out. And other things that you can do is you can add a building pad. And this is really great if you have a basement. The building pad is very simple. In fact, it knows that you want to use a building, so it has the Select Walls tool. And what this will do is if you have a basement, it won't show up in section. It doesn't look any different here, but it does kind of help as you're drawing other types of drawings. And you can also add parking spots. Who doesn't love parking spots? And parking spots are nice because they make reference to the topo surface itself. So you just click on topo surface, and like magic, it is available there. Oh, and it looks like when I added my basement here, it did kind of warp my project a little bit. If you get something like this where you've wrecked your lovely slope, you can come in here. And let me use my reference plane because it's so handy. And I can edit my topo surface and add in any extra points that help to define the slope here. See how now that straightens it right out. And then I can add a few more. What did I say the street was at? -1, I think. Yep. So I'll add those -1s over here just below these points. And again, it will keep adjusting those topo surfaces. Oh, I guess I still have a little bit of warpiness going on there. I'll have to add a few more points here to make this thing play right. But anyway, and that's how you create your site. There we go, a lovely curb. The other thing that you can do, besides placing parking spots, is you can add site components. These components are basically trees. You can absolutely use the Revit trees. They're not exactly the nicest thing in the world, and we will find that when we get to Enscape, as you may know from SketchUp, using Enscape with SketchUp, it has some lovely, lovely site components that we'll use. So put yourself in a nice exterior view that shows off the lovely site you created, and export a PDF.